space for, and yet somehow at the same time they sort of do. It can feel like sometimes. It's funny how when you're part of those communities, all these different insights, the things that naturally just come up to me are like little incisions or pathways into the broad map of us all together making sense of this transitionary moment. And so my mind's sort of one of those that takes the impulse of that, and all of a sudden there's like 10 paths we can walk down. You know, we were just talking about different cognitive styles and their sort of engineering type, and then we didn't quite name the other type, but maybe a more intuitive, relational, pattern making, whole making kind of dynamic. And that's definitely very resonant for me, as one of the balances on which the communication and sense making dynamic, I think, oscillates and turns as we together sort of attempt to see and practice how we can create culture making spaces, game making spaces, relational making spaces in this time between worlds, which is such a beautiful phrase. And that's where I find myself very much focused at the moment, how even to conceptualize and get a grip on how much time these interactions should take, you know, the different elements and phases of them, the different sort of commitment journeys or rites of passage people might need to take in order to arrive at them, how to understand at once sort of omni-participation and still a sort of qualitative hierarchy of whether it's knowledge sharing or who are we orienting to in this particular domain of uncertainty, with so many different domains of knowledge and ways of looking at the world, all these different epistemologies which ought to be brought to bear in their time, yet somehow to integrate that into a pluralism, as you were saying, Greg, before. So all of that is interesting for me, and just how to show up to that space where expectations can be so different on the part of an audience or someone who wants to come along. And there's no playbook, because I really do feel we are trying to feel out what it is to sort of remake a common space, remake what comes after, if you like, a certain kind of academia and religious structure that can nevertheless enable symbolic generative participation among as many people as possible. So that's just, whew.
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant and beautiful. And I think you're articulating, you know, this sort of tension of this time very, very well. I'd like to circle back to that. But before I do, I wonder if it would help folks here just to give you a little bit of your biography, to give a little bit of the story about how you came to Voicecraft. What called you into this space?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have searched my soul for that several times. And I can pretty well make a coherent story of it going back into childhood. I mean, so I've done at least enough work to, I think, map things on to that amount. And to be honest, I think it's relevant. So, I mean, when I was roughly 8, my parents' marriage started to fall apart. And then by 11, they had divorced in a way that was quite challenging to deal with. And I went to Australia with my mum. And so, you know, there's some splitting of the world parents there in some important sense. And then an unfortunate warring of them in a way that placed my psyche somehow in the center, almost fighting itself. And of course, that's not how I processed it at the time. In many ways, I retreated into a certain kind of depression. I had a lot of friends and I still went out and did things in the world. I wasn't absolutely room bound, but I certainly had a deep dissatisfaction after having a really beautiful childhood. So I always had this I had this glorified sense of love and home and friendship and community. I really had a beautiful first 8 years on the world, to which I'm so grateful for. Hey. And then not that. and then starting to realize that moving countries, and then making my way out into the world, just a broad communication problem of how to meet others in a space of what was most actually resonantly there, meaning wise. Often we begin our interactions and we sort of feel each other out at a level that's maybe up here. How's the weather? How's this? How's that? And that's all important. But, I gradually began to find that it was what was really there to speak about in terms of what's going on and what are we doing here and what matters became something I didn't want to avoid. And so I began working that in more and more, I suppose, to my persona in terms of how I met the world. And then after having experiences with academia, so I did philosophy and international relations and a master's in philosophy at the University of...
Can I pause you just for a second? Because it really sounds to me, and I think this is a very, very crucial thing for us to think about in this time between worlds. It sounds to me your formative experience has this pretty strong split experience of here is friendship and security and safety and love, and then here it's not, right? And then the vulnerability of what that can be. And of course, when you're 8, you have no capacity to understand the dynamics between parents, right? So all of a sudden you get thrust upon it, but there's the sense making that's available to you and what that means. And then if it's a hostile thing, then you get pulled in these different modes that then get ingrained in you. And the contrast of that would then structure your sense making system pretty dramatically, it would seem.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. And I'd make a similar move to, or at least I conceptualize that similar move also with regard to, can we say domains of knowledge? Like if we factor something like psychedelic experience, for instance, or deep transformative states, where you might have a certain, I mean, Jung had a nice phrase. He said, to touch the sphere where the paint is made, right? Just to gesture at this, I mean, in more academic language, you might say like transcendent bases from which properties and qualities themselves emerge and co-shape each other or something like this. And so, but the point is, all of a sudden you can have a sense, an image, a view of how the world can be put together or can be realized. You see deeper than patterns that you can actually be in an integrated relationship with. And then the question is, well, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to be able to energetically organize yourself and manage yourself over a certain period of time in community with others fundamentally, so that you can put these pieces together? And if you can do that, then you have in some important sense seen into the landscape in a way that can be valuable. But of course, we see so often with various kinds of people, people who struggle to integrate deep breaks in their lives, that it can also make life very, very challenging. So yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. Thanks. I didn't mean to pause you, but it just seemed to be
it's very right
in relation.
No, it's very right.
And you said then that were you always drawn to philosophy in university, or were you?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I basically, so for my last few years in high school, I by the end of it, I didn't attend some of my final exams, and I didn't hand in the most important assignments, or at least we had this year-long English assessment, which was basically the main piece where most of your mark came from. And I had written a play and acted in this play sort of extracurricularly the night before. And that's where all my focus was. I didn't do a single piece of work on this English assignment. And the next day, waking up in my mate's house, in his kitchen, just grabbed a book off the shelf, looked at the blurb and wrote 100 words for a 3,000 word assignment, and obviously failed it. So that was my mentality towards doing what was necessary in order to get the grades to go to university. So I just scraped into a university where the entry requirements were much lower. And, I did something broad and was motivated by then. And, after a year of traveling and ended up, yes, I was always drawn towards philosophy. I was drawn towards that's a hard thing to put into words. It's like I was never satisfied at all while being at university. I was never satisfied that the moments of earnest, meaningful conversations with professors that I found 1% of the time occasionally in their office, apart from one or two right at the end, it was always, that always drew me in the direction of, yeah, of course it's a questioning. It's just trying to drop into actually, no, hang on a second. Are we, I mean, what is philosophy? It's a certain, I mean, at the very least, you want to try and take everything into account, whatever everything means, right? If there's a domain that you're not willing to even look at or integrate, then I don't think you're opening yourself out to the fullness of what philosophy at least can be.
Right.
So yeah, feeling it's I suppose it's in many ways it's the relationship between that brokenness and then a truthful, integrous way of acting in relationship to that. Fundamentally,
I had a very similar reaction to my psychology professors. I think I held the same basic orientation around psychology, close to philosophy, and wanted to see, and was so disappointed so frequently about the inability of my professors at times to drop into the here and now and being in the moment of what felt most alive, but would instead be behind a textbook framed of reference. I thankfully had an exception to that who's in the audience, Joe Mikulski, who was a professor of mine. But it is interesting, isn't it, also in relation to the presence and aliveness, or how often that can be absented in relation to the conversations.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors that would come into it there, because the thing is that through all of that, I actually did see into the goodness and openness of so many professors. It's just that, you know, they were speaking to me because they were paid to do so, and that, you know, I probably didn't quite like that, to be honest with you. I always, and so anyway, there's a bunch more things to be said about why I sort of took the academic route I did. I suspended and extended my master's. It took me 3 and a bit years to complete it. I moved countries in that time, a whole bunch of personal, relational reasons thrown in there. But fundamentally, where it sort of led intellectually, I suppose, was to sort of what we were touching on at the beginning, my master's dissertation, which I certainly don't stand behind as a particularly good piece of work, was on I called it part making, whole making, and process. And it was essentially my attempt to try and situate the epistemic credibility I felt was there from engaging with the mystical states and psychedelic experience into a framework that was also capable of pointing at something ontological. And so I was drawn towards process philosophy and various kinds of ways of thinking like that, which weren't at all part of the philosophy of science credo that my university professors sort of wanted to see. And so, yeah, it's been about finding people to speak with who I can fundamentally relate to and ultimately explore deep questions of the world with, for the purpose fundamentally of building things worthwhile. That's what I've been trying to do, and all the different hurdles of trying to do that when you haven't come through, or at least achieved enough to show that you've got credibility from within that academic institution, but you still sound, especially with my accent as well, you still sound academic to people outside of it. And so it's this weird, you know,
you are sounding academic, Tim.
Right. Yeah, I sound academic. I do sound academic, but then, you know, I like to think at least that even these most profound concepts we can speak about, if they can't be navigated, if they can't inform an appropriate, flowing, transformative dialogue between whomever you're speaking to, and providing perhaps, and here's where we perhaps could speak about values, you know, the kind of values that if one embodies, you know, and is committed to in some sense, whether consciously or unconsciously, I don't know. It depends how seriously we take the academic level in order to, you know, be on the train there. But if we can hold ourselves in a certain way, and treat each other in a certain way, then just what's possible in terms of shared cognition, we can say that, a shared generative relationality, and how to create structures that enable as many people as possible to connect and transform through integrous interaction is something that seems to be deeply important in this time. And yeah, I see somewhere we could take this conversation with all of us, to be honest with you. And I was thinking of a frame just late last night, actually. It was a continuation of a conversation I just had with Alexander Bard and Andrew Sweeney. I know you've been speaking with them. I listened to your conversation as well. And it's sort of a synthesis of some of the, or at least what I detect as sort of tectonic plates of our collective response to this transitionary moment, just in this particular regard of how we navigate involving this question of as many people as possible, which in some sense sounds so grandiose given there's billions of us, right? But just to lay out that frame, maybe this is something, I mean, if you all would like to engage in maybe a generative conversation about, like, maybe you guys can help us. This is important. I feel it's very important. So okay. We have, on the one hand, a view that someone like Alexander Bard is championing quite a bit through the term exodus. And we have stories of this, of course. We have stories of building an ark, right? Where we gather only those who, one, are essentially ready, willing, and able to gather so that we can journey to a land and build something different. And then on the other hand, we have, and you know, there's going to be a bit of a polemic in this. There is a space between, right? But on the other hand, we've got something that I will say someone like Daniel Schmachtenberger is most notable for in the space. There are other thinkers definitely behind him for sure. And that is, well, hang on a second. Given exponential technology, which I just translate into my mind as more power in smaller boxes that more people will have access to, right? Plus a rise in, you know, the meaning crisis, meta crisis, plug all of that in. Plug the fact that it is maybe more probable than ever that atomized individuals will respond to their desire for meaning by bandying together with each other for various kinds of extremist thought, which essentially disallow a certain capacity for integrated pluralism through a kind of loving relationality with the unknown and other perspectives that effectively clash what is such a delicate and vulnerable little core of identity, because they've been dehomed and deatomized and all these things. Like, we're struggling so much, I think, at this level. We can turn to, whether it's through weaponizing communication on the internet, whether it is through quite literally powerful technology like nuclear weapons, and in the future, whether it's through things like CRISPR, whether it's through recognizing what the fragilities are in our systemic supply chains, power grids, like you name it, all the ways we're fragile, all the ways that this big thing can be toppled down. How can we live together and create effectively the educational protocols such that everyone can develop that wisdom required to discern what is something like a loving choice for the whole in its continued making? And all of that stuff needs a bit more definition, of course, but broadly it's like, in this moment, is it about gathering a certain group, a certain network, and looking to create things and essentially be ready to one day build again or thrive once certain things break down? Or is this about some broader project of reform where, in some sense, even more people are held into mind? something in there, I think, is a really generative context for discussion.
Beautiful. I've got lots I could say about that, but I'm going to punt and see if so I'll just summarize it so that for people who are not necessarily following this. But yes, you have Alexander Bard, who was on our TOK list. And then after a little while, Bard can be a little, shall we say, abrupt in some of his communication styles and a little jarring. And our TOK academic listserv was a little bit different in tone. And so Bard and I agreed with big hugs and love all the way around that he would do his dancing over on the intellectual deep web. But he does have a vision, basically, of a certain kind of exodus and rise above as the digital libido consumes the populace. And that's, and he's going to sort of ride that train in a particular way and wants to lead a particular vision for that, but it is not, it's not exactly a maternal holding of the masses, shall we say, okay? And in contrast, you have Daniel Schmachtenberger, who would probably represent sort of a systematic approach to thinking about the trajectory of the world, and inviting both bottom-up and top-down transformation that diagnoses it as game A, a competitive, consumeristic, resource, power-based structure, and then just create a system for distributing that. And is that the ultimate sort of move and vision? And they clash some on that. So those are the two. And then there's this idea of, well, yeah, what is emerging? What would we be oriented to value-wise? I mean, not that we necessarily have choices, but what drives us and what vision will we be following? So that's just my echo of perhaps less elegantly said than what Tim spelled out, but in perhaps more concretely specifiable terms about what Bard and Daniel Schmachtenberger represent. Is that a fair summary, Tim, with what?
Yeah, I think so. And it's always interesting when we summarize others. It's so challenging because in some almost mystical way, it's like you can never truly do it. And I can already hear people disagree and go, no, state your case. What are the propositions? Actually, we can pin each other down. And yes, we can if we're willing to play those kind of roles. But I always, both Daniel and Alexander are still present with me in this. We as humans, we kind of look, this thing about naming stuff. It's so important for us to kind of go, here's a place you can stand and here's a place you can stand. And then all of a sudden that the generative individual there can be lost just a little bit. But I think that's broadly fair. Yeah, I do.
Rob,
yeah, Rob, please.
Can I just add something? Yeah, I think that in the same way that an individual who's having a psychological challenge is often very attached to some catastrophe that they're imagining, I think that we're doing that in the collective pretty strongly as well. And that we don't give ourselves individually or collectively as much robustness as we actually have, right? Like I used to watch Evel Knievel, jump a thing and bounce 14 times into a wall, and he was probably on fire half the time. And yeah, he never walked the same again, but he walked again, like it was like, we can do this. So I think as much as we're holding on to cultural stuff, we're going to watch culture shift happen here. I also think that the average person, because I do this, I mean, this is literally what I do. I take people of average intelligence and average, just your regular old average human, suffering or not suffering. And with a very simple couple of wisdom moves, you have this deep change in how they make meaning going forward, and their own resilience and ability is in a much different thing. So I'm very excited about what we can do top down and bottom up with just a couple of kind of wisdom moves that make everything make a little bit more sense. And from a valuation standpoint, if we're lost, if we let corporations and technology do all these things, and capitalism that creates needs we don't really have, and then we get attached to those and we suffer because of those attachments, if we can't free ourselves of those attachments, we're going to continue to suffer and cause other suffering. But the wisdom move is to wake up and realize that actual joy and security and all these things doesn't cost the money that we think it costs. It's way more relational based. It's way more in Can I actually bring my attention back to breath and have some sense of happiness and simplicity, whatever? Can I enjoy a piece of music and not need to go buy everything at the mall to be happy, or whatever that is, right? There's these real moves that actually fix a ton of stuff as we do them. I just don't think enough of us know about those, or and I don't think we've done a good job of making those cool, right? We still have all the cool people out there sort of selling the stuff that erodes our sense of well-being and all these other things. And so I'm really, I see the existential threat, and all of it's very real, and we can watch things, break down very badly. But I think we're, even at the worst of that, I think that we're still, there's a version of us that can thrive after that. And I don't expect a lot of that stuff to happen in the same way, just because I see how easy it is to change people, and it's easier than we think it is. So that would be some propositions I'll throw out there, I guess.
Yeah.
And Tim, I don't know about your podcast, but I would love to talk more with you, because it sounds like you're having the kind of conversations that I want to have. And I've got a whole system of, ideation behind everything I was just talking about. So
yeah, well, I'd love to. In fact, I was saying to Greg just before we started this, actually, that I thought this was much earlier in the day for me. So it's 10 a.m. here. And I thought it was actually going to start at 6, because we booked this and the time that the daylight saving hadn't changed. And I also made a mistake. And so I'd actually, I think you guys can expect to see me just come back here for conversations anyway. So there's that. But there's also, there's practical stuff to speak about in terms of organizing conversations and research groups, and what the dynamics of interacting in this network space are. And that's a lot of where will be focusing my attention, actually, away from the podcast. But that sort of takes us into, in a way, a conversation that's centered on my own sort of strategic thinking about some of these questions. So point being, we can definitely talk again, and there's many others I think who'd enjoy a conversation. But just to pick up on one thing you said, and just to, creatively push back a little bit here, it's this on this framing of changing people. It's certainly been the case that I've been involved in relationships and moments where change has occurred, and we have made shifts. But I would consider that we were likely energetically available and ready to do so. And in a certain phase of life where the changing of patterns, once we'd been able to step back and re-look at the world again, or adopt a witnessing function, or reorient from some transcendent space fundamentally, we were able to carry through on. And I recognize with people I've known in my life, and family, and a whole bunch of things. And Greg, I'm sure as a psychotherapist would have lots to say about this. I'm just getting a bit of feedback there. Oh, cool. All right. Okay. Nope, still there. I'm gonna have to manage it. It's all right. It's how do we manage to sustain these changes, and what's required from the environment, and our structures of support. And that brings up for me all these questions again. And I can very easily get lost with just all the contextual changes that I feel do need to occur in order to enable the embedding of these healthy routines of, we can say, waking up on an ongoing basis. Because I can just notice myself just get dragged back into patterns that don't serve again and again. So part of me, wants to pump the brakes a little bit on just how easy it is to change people. The way I sort of think about it metaphorically is that, we can extend the hand, but it's like pulling people along. I don't think it works. I think it's actually too energetically taxing. And ultimately, if we speak about a value like dignity, for instance, I really like how Greg puts it, be that which enhances well-being and dignity with integrity, I believe is how you phrase it, Greg.
Yep.
And for me, I relate to dignity as something like that, that essential element or essence of choice and involvement and deep, authentic participation, on the agency of that, you can say individual or individual, depends, you know, who you're talking to.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. It's so important. And so it's these cultures and contexts that I'm so interested in are like, it's like how do we create environments where signal is generated that offers appropriate invitation that then can be accepted or rejected as a sovereign choice, and then it can be fulfilled or unfulfilled as, again, maybe we might say the integrity of whether or not that relational offer was in fact integrous. That's how I'm kind of thinking about it. Now, I'm not saying there aren't these wisdom moves we can make, and in that sense, change isn't possible. It's just, God, I find it so hard to change myself. Bloody hell.
No, I think that's I'm curious as to what either your evolution into Voicecraft and what you've seen, or if you're moving in a different direction. What is your sense about the changes in the communities and what feels hopeful or not so hopeful in terms of what's on your landscape or horizon or history of experience?
Yeah. So the question of the role and function of broadcast is really important in there. And that's something that's been spoken about quite a bit. I've had the experience of recording probably around 70 podcasts, releasing about 51, 52. Many of those were recorded before I really started, if you like. But, and then many other kinds of events that are released unlisted and what have you. But I notice, for me, the amount of energy it takes both in, and then that it costs me to have something out there hanging, you know. And I'm really feeling I feel the exposure of that, and I'm actually in a phase of real retraction, not from wanting to interact with people, but from wanting to interact in a way that makes much more clear and available the opportunity for further relational engagement and integration. And so I also look at many of the conversations that I'm wanting to have not be appropriate for public sharing, whether they're about certain challenges I might be having individually, but more broadly, how those relate to some of these deeper existential states and doubts that I think do need to be presenced, but that are presenced in a way of vulnerability and creative construction, that unless those participating and listening are themselves able to hold their own space and share appropriately in that space, would ultimately be potentially dislodging and unhelpful for people's sense making and identity structures, which I think is very interesting, because when we speak about lineage traditions and wisdom traditions, and how you know, Alexander Bard refers to this as the Bard absolute. And I'm not exactly straight on whether or not I'm completely aligned with how to relate to this. It actually relates to the broader conversation, as we were using Daniel Schmachtenberger as this other pole. It's I think we've had a breakdown essentially in the opportunities for people to find stable, dialogically transformative ways of relating. And I notice how easy it is for people to get the wrong end of the stick, to project onto broadcast, to be captured by broadcast, and then to capture the broadcast back. Because if the broadcast is sustaining itself on that attention and money, then it's going to end up, you know, the phenomenon of audience capture. So how to preserve the integrity of the being here together in nevertheless a structure that's looking to extend invitations through this medium, through this digital medium, is exactly for me, what I hear a lot in the question. And so what I hear, the next phase of the ongoing experiment for me is when I look at structures like the Stoa, for instance, which I was in many ways conceiving at various points last year, in this a communal, like one way to look at it is like a communal type podcast. So there was this issue with having the interviewer or the host be so primarily involved in all of the conversations, and this need for a more open cultural space around which to gather. That was something I saw clearly, and Peter's done so fantastically well with building into that kind of space. And so the way I sort of see things is that, well, I say what we need, this is a hope need, right? Like it's to be subject to change, but it's, I see a distributed network of somewhat closed, somewhat open. So there's a way to become involved, but it requires a certain amount of contribution, and it's not somewhere to just come and extract from, but somewhere to come and participate in, where there are protocols developed to help us understand who should be speaking with who should be interacting with who for their own mutual benefit and enabling of choice and growth and development and action in the world. To try and stoke this flame of researching and collaborating and going through all the difficulties of that together, and to link these networks through what are still to be developed as bridging sort of meta spaces, meta cultural spaces, with a kind of shamanically induced several hours of interaction among people who have been from some mechanism of qualitative distinction rise so as to then interact and speak on behalf, if you like, of what has been a resonant insight generated in that community, but who are nevertheless stepping forward in a way that is to be generative again. But then we also have to distinguish between a generative modes and then knowledge dissemination modes, which is critically important. There's so much stuff to be worked out, but it all comes back to how, like, what are the dynamics of these new spaces for interacting when we're switching channels and we're all of a sudden including a broader swathe of the psyche as it's developed and particularized to certain niches, but has to again tap into and be appropriately infused by a shared sense of, we can say, a shared vision, a shared project, that from this pluralistic, that incorporates these pluralistic things. And then we've got to have a local level, and there's much more to say there, but that's in the beginnings of my thought,
Right. No, it's really interesting. Reactions or thoughts to that? That sparked a lot of different things in me, but I'm really curious. Waldemar? I'll unmute.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation, Tim. It seems to me that one of the things that you were saying is that the directions you think we should go in require some reflexivity on the part of people. It require also a devotion to integrity. But I look at the recent elections in our country, not as a political matter, but as a reflection, for instance, of people looking for meaning. And our country is roughly split half and half, slightly more on one side this time than on the last side. But I don't see those people, and I would like to hear your opinion, and others as well. I don't see those people who, one half of those people, I see them as not being all that interested in integrity, not interested perhaps at all in reflexivity. And the question comes to my mind, how do you, as you said, draw these people in to participate in building something better. At some level, it feels like we aren't going to do that with those people. That what we are dealing with is an immense failure on the part of American education. I will just speak about America, not other countries. And that if we want to draw those people in, we're going to have to start a lot earlier than the voters. Somehow, if we want to draw the voters in who are not interested in integrity and in reflexivity, somehow we have to come up with a way to make that pay off for them. I think we can do that with children by working with their reward system and how they perceive rewards. I'm not convinced that we can do that with the people who aren't interested in trying. I see them as saying, I accept this idea of Trumpism because I don't have to work on reflexivity. It's too much hard work. It brings up too many problems in my life, and my life becomes less secure than it was even before. It's much easier to say, I believe in this guy, he's right. It's okay, we'll follow him.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's beautifully articulated. I think that speaks to a really resonant concern. And it's one I share. I have a bunch of responses to it. They're to be formulated together over several hours, probably more than that, realistically. There's serious questions, obviously. I want to share first and one image of how I think about this, and then I want to say something that hopefully will be a bit more analytical. The image is, for me, if we are building an ark, then a bit like the ship of Theseus, that which continually remakes itself, any philosopher who's been unfortunate enough to have that come up in a lesson will know what I'm talking about.
Is it the same thing?
Yeah. A bit like that ship, an ark being built now that's traveling to another land. My sense is that the wood for its continued remaking is in both lands, and that we're moving always back and forth. And I'm not interested in an exodus that utterly cuts itself off. I think an exodus that utterly cuts itself off is essentially violating the essence of integrous relationship with ecology that we're pointing to here, that has in many ways already broken down to such a point. But it's there, I'd say, I hope what's hopefully going to be a bit more of an analytical thing, which is that if we take, use the example of a certain sort of Trump voter who feels like it's too much work, too much effort to undergo a certain reflexive process and is just going to go with Trump. There is a mode of thought out there which says of that Trump voter that there is such a challenge to what they perceive and relate to as their own integrity, maybe of their family structure, of their community, that there's something about the shifting tides of culture already, about the opposing attitudes and judgmental views towards how things should change, made from a moralistic type standpoint on the other side, that their integrity is challenged to the point where, in a way, we might say that the avenue of Trump is actually a direct response to them standing for their own integrity. And you're right that the reflexivity isn't there in order for them to maybe come from where we're speaking about. But for me, where that conversation ultimately goes is back to a framing, because the only way I can find grounding in it that has me not lose hope fundamentally is to come back to a grounding in the dynamics of communication, and again seeing this as a broad communication problem. And what are the ways I myself can, in this case, us together, I myself can come to attend to the always available channels of communication that do exist dialogically within self, but also with me and to the world through others. To what degree can I attend to what those dynamics are, and to what degree can I build essentially a structure of invitations? I can't see it. I don't see it another way. A structure of invitations that get fulfilled or unfulfilled, which can continue to open up space and share in space where the integrity of relationship can be presenced. And I know I've just come back in a way, and it hasn't addressed these broad problems with the big culture, but in some fundamental sense, I think we're stuck in this middle place of for me, ethically, it being ethically necessary that openness to vital relationship with life is maintained until that opening of channel becomes taxing to the point where that vital process itself entirely breaks down. Now, where are those lines? How does that actually manifest? I mean, this is down to discernment imminently, based on as well what we can make sense of, given how we can integrate all these different modalities of problem solving and epistemologies into this broad picture, which is unbelievably complex. And we're just these evolved things. I think, I think we're almost mystically evolved things, to be honest with you and I. But God, it's so challenging and difficult. There's no easy answer, is there? It's very concerning.
What I wondered, Joe, maybe you had a question. If you did, we can come back to that. But this bridges some of our conversation earlier. So for me, a straight on approach to try to leverage something to get people changing that already are at a place, that's not, I don't see how that works. Certainly not by anything that we're doing and the kind of activities that we're engaged in. Doesn't seem to relate to that, in the sense that so what are we actually going to do? Try to convince individuals who are not reflexively, oriented to become that per se? To me, one of the things, and this is what I wanted to get your take on, and actually Mike Mascola would probably appreciate this comment, is I do wonder if we can elevate discussion of values in a particular way, elevate the conversations about what is, a good way of being. You articulated, I don't think it was very conscious, but you articulated the desire for the evolution and emergence of the space. It was more content than value-based, but it created a very, very clear picture, in my mind at least, of the kind of world we would like to live in. And that's one of the things that I'm wondering if we don't hit enough of. And it actually brings me back to this whole concept of wisdom energy I'm working on. But it's like, can we invite people to think about the kind of world that we want to live in and engage in more conversations that make salient the values that we might be reflective on and what it is that we might want to move toward and move away from, rather than describing the situation, cultivating positions, and even saying, here's choices between Bart or Daniel Schmachtenberger. To me, a momentum toward a valued state of being and articulations about what those values are and how those can manifest and how we can come together and embody them seems part of this whole equation, at least. And I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that an engine, a self-making dynamic here that is to be, that's hopefully we can leverage. Even that's language I'm not super happy with, but is how can we venerate a kind of pointing to or reflection on a particular, it wouldn't necessarily be it wouldn't have to be a style, but we're speaking about values. It's almost like it's what are the essential qualities that become those that are desired to be mimicked, but where if mimicking them is actually like cultivating a mode of development that itself enables generative interaction and the enablement of choice for others in a pluralistic way, then that's kind of bang on. I mean, I think we have to leverage that way of that kind of socio-analytical or anthropological, sociological. I mean, the Girard comes to mind with the imitation and developmental theory, and it's not something I know a huge amount about, but we certainly have to see about reorienting. People talk about the word cool, reorienting structures of cool from extractive, positioning, competitive, to the extent those are present, towards a kind of collaborative but appropriate mixture of inclusion and exclusion. So I think of things like collective participation in art. So for instance, my partner Taryn, she's a painter, and we've been sort of talking about for a long time, we would have done it if not for COVID, but having events where there's collective conversation, and she's also layering paint down, and she's working on these techniques of layering paint much the same way that conversations can work, and that over time they reveal the sort of patterns of creativity that have gone into the dialogue itself, have gone into the paint, and now we can look at it again, take a reflection and look at the pattern. So are there ways that through participating together we can actually create art of a kind that then becomes an attraction point for more people? But the only way you can actually create the art, let's say, is through actually engaging in the kind of collaboration, which would be an appropriate sort of listening, speaking when you feel called to spoke, but appropriately, that's in a kind of rhythm, like a rhythm of collaboration, reorienting that hierarchy of what is valued, I do think is critical. And yet it has to be done, to me at least, through this ongoing process of feeling out what's appropriate. And it's why it's so important to come for me, for example, to come to conversations like this. Like, this isn't easy for me, I would say, but I feel it's deeply important, and I have so much gratitude for the opportunity to have a conversation at all. So for me, it's I'm very fortunate I have this opportunity to express myself and receive feedback in this way. Like, it's not lost on me how important that is for my own development. And so what that brings up for me is the like the critical importance of everyone's attention here and listening. This wouldn't be possible unless we were all engaged. And so there has to be an acknowledgement and real veneration for who aren't, they're not audience members, but participants. So rather than the Instagram, it's just people liking my stuff, it's just a broadcast audience, like a veneration for that relational dynamic, which enables finding oneself in a space with others, like undergoing that work of figuring out who I am, or who I ought to be in relation to everyone here. So it's finding this, it's being relationally valued, Greg, that you speak about. You could plug in that whole way of speaking about this here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rob?
So I love this conversation of values, and I also love this conversation of sort of painting a future. I think a lot of us are following almost models of, we're way more unconscious than we think we are. And we've got some story or something going on, or my partner votes this way, so I'm going to vote this way. I don't think we're all doing this thoughtful thing where we're really making a choice and making a stand. We're going with whoever we work with, or, whatever last 3 news things we watched or whatever. And then I think that this values conversation is really interesting, because I think we all value the same things. I mean, Greg, your influence matrix, right? It's very clear that it's fairly universal how we are motivated towards certain values and away from other values. I think on the pleasure pain, well below that, we all tend to prefer pleasure over pain. We can get wired as a masochist in some way, and that can get weird. But and then I think up in the grouping stuff, we tend to value similar things. But in the moment of our own needs and the situation of whatever's relevant to us in the moment, you know, I may value my own pleasure over some agreement up here, and we're not navigating that well, right? So I think of my father, who voted very differently than me and thought very differently than me. However, if we actually just talk about our values without putting politics around it, our values are very similar, but what he believes this leader is going to do for his values, et cetera, that's where it gets wonky and confusing. And so we don't have wisdom around that, right? We don't understand legitimately what we're valuing, where we're going, how we're doing that. And so building wisdom into that is part of the shortcut where we can start to have better shared grouping, better relational needs that are obvious and we all understand them, and we can move away from power moves, but more to inclusion type moves. Then we can understand when pleasure and pain are out of balance, what that does for us, et cetera. And so I think we need wisdom about this and better stories so that we can show what it looks like, so that people that aren't going to be doing a lot of critical thinking themselves can live into based on these stories. But we're surrounded by violent stories and horrible stories. And then even our intellectuals are painting worst case scenario of the disaster of everything, which is true and a possibility. But like my father is surrounded by, he's literally every morning we would wake up and we would have a certain conversation. It's some of our nicest moments because he hasn't had a drink yet. You know, there's lots of stuff that's going on there. However, it would always start with this real disaster because he's surrounded by a book about the end of money, the end of America, the end of it, like it's all collapsing, right? And that's like what he's surrounded by. And I go, Dad, like, what do you think you're going to think the world is like if that's what you're surrounded by? And he goes, well, none of these are wrong. And I go, maybe, but they're not the only thing that are right either. There's lots of, you know, there's innovation and there's collaboration and there's lots of good things happening too. And so, but if you're not looking at any of that, you go out into the world modeling that, behaving like that, you know, shutting down, being afraid, having loaded weapons in your car, like all kinds of crazy things that just builds. And so if we can't be in a narrative space, a shared collective space where we're, you know, talking about values and what other values would lead to, et cetera, then we can have better conversations. One other thing about what Waldemar said, I think that in general, to make meaning, we do something which is categorize, right? We might do this, have an experience with a certain race of people, and it's a shortcut or a heuristic to categorize. Well, if we categorize all Trump voters a certain way, we start to make a meaning about a whole half of our country, but it's way more nuanced than that. And there may be people who voted a certain way that, you know, are following an unfolding of their beliefs in a certain way that personally you would like them very much and see very much alike, but they just voted a different way. And so let's not throw out half the country based on a single vote when there were only really two choices to make, and you know, people had to fall one way or the other. There's a lot more nuance in that, I think.
Well, in my defense, I wasn't throwing half of the people out. I'm just saying that there are those two main groups. Granted, they are not uniform. They're made up of many other groups as well. But underlying that, to me, it seems that some people look carefully at reflective things and integrity, and other people don't. Why don't they?
I think that's really, really useful. I don't know that I would make that line at the 50%, you know, ish vote we just had, right? I think that on both sides, that's happening in lots of ways. But I totally appreciate your point. I'm not.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
That point of asking the question why applies to both groups.
Yeah.
The separation of groups in our country in such a stark manner is something worth looking at. It doesn't describe how it happened, but it describes something.
Yeah. Joe, you had your question on up and you want to chime in? Do you have a hand up there, Joe?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so Tim, thanks first of all for sharing your perspective and some of what you're doing. I tend to talk too much, so I'm going to try and be brief. I actually wrote a couple notes down very quickly. So one is to Valdemar's point of this discussion, Rob, you just elaborated a bit. What I found, Greg, do you remember the name of the guy? Zach, maybe you do. I attended the meeting on the paradox a couple weeks ago. Do you remember who that was?
Michael F.
Okay, so at that meeting, I appreciated what they're trying to do, and they want to open up dialogue between liberals and conservatives and people with different views, right? To help move the conversation along. But the first thing I was said, and I stated the case to the moderators. I said, well, here's the difficulty I'm already sensing. I said, how many of the people who are at this sort of an event are people who want to engage, who want to learn, want to change, want to understand different perspectives? And then I threw out my hypothesis to one of the moderators in private. I said, my prediction would be, as a sociologist, that almost everybody here, if not everybody, would be quote unquote liberal or progressive in their views. And they said, oh, well, no, that's not what we're about. And I have lots of conservative friends. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know that's not the point. I want to know how many people are at this meeting. And as it turns out, when they asked us to do a dialogue, they had a very difficult time finding a single conservative. They did, one guy, but he was actually more kind of progressive. So my point is at the meta level, and this is the nerd research, most of the research demonstrates time and again that there are differences in terms of people's amenability to pursuing and their openness to new ideas. And by definition, if you are a conservative, and I grew up, everybody in my family is a conservative. What that means, though, is that you're not open to changing your worldview or embracing, by definition, that in the narrowest sense. That doesn't mean that every conservative is like that. It won't, can't have a dialogue with. And I'll explain where you can make the change in a moment. But by definition, most people who are progressive, the whole idea, except for the extremists, the whole idea is to try to engage and learn from others. And the reason you value diversity is not because you want to be a social justice warrior, rather because you want to hear different perspectives. You want to learn from different people and so on. So that's what the quote unquote true progressive is supposed to be about. In other words, what leads to progress. Related to that is that people almost always only go, even liberals or progressives, almost always only attend, they have their own echo chambers. So they listen to and they go to the podcasts that they like, that are stimulating to them. So we all have that sort of bias already built in. And I don't mean to be critical of Greg or Tim or Becky or anybody else, but it is a pretty narrow demographic who tends to tune into these kinds of things. I don't see the diversity and both demographically and intellectually. And that's not a criticism of what you're doing. I think you're doing the right thing. But the point is that, okay, so we're missing, to Valdemar's point, millions and millions of people who are not tuning into these conversations. And the reason that is, if I can, again, I tell you I talk too much, but I just have all these ideas. But the reason that is because sociologically, we are living in so many different worlds. So if you look at the red states down the middle of the United States, these are people who are living in a completely different reality. They've farmed, they've worked the land, they've done whatever for generations. They're not bad people, evil people, or even necessarily completely unreflective. It's what they know. And I know this from studying not only those folks, but from studying people in the Newfoundland fishery industry, which collapsed in 1992. That's all they'd ever known for generations. They had a certain worldview, a certain way of passing things along generation to generation. And when that collapsed, they had no idea where to go and where to turn to, all right? And then the research shows that people who are facing these crises, they do look to authorities and authoritarian sources for that meaning, for that comfort, for that security. And the final point is that everyone in my family, I had 5 siblings and my mother, who's 91, they all voted for Trump in 2016. And only one changed her mind. And she's literally the most reflective. But the reasons that the others did is for all of these different reasons, the many nuances. One's just flat out racist. One is straight out transactional, loves money, doesn't care about anything else. One had a brain injury and was always, TBI, and was always conservative anyway. So now just reflexively, can't think any other way, literally at this point, right? My mother, who's in early stages dementia, has always voted Republican. That's just what she does. A sister who was abused severely by her spouse, and her spouse was but nevertheless a Republican and a Trumpist, and she divorced him, but she's got a lot of that in her now. Okay. And then the one sister who changed her mind was the one who said, well, I looked at this is literally what she said. I looked at their policies in 2000 and I hated Trump, but I just thought that the Republican policies in general were more like, what I identify with. And now 4 years later, she goes, I can't believe what's happened. So she's for the first time voted for a Democrat. You see, so and my family is a composite of, again, many of these different worldviews. And that doesn't even get into, as I mentioned, the people living in the Midwest, the people living in completely different worlds where they're not exposed to this. So I guess where I would conclude is that I love what we're trying to do here, but again, look who's at this meeting, look who's at most of these meetings. And the only way you can get to that, Voldemort, to your point, is what I find is literally in one-on-one conversations. Like I mentioned, I won't go through it again, this cab drive with a Georgian, and the only way it got through, we had a great conversation, is by not identifying the politics of the positions, but to getting at the core values. So we talked about family, we talked about health struggles, and what we both, without getting into the politics and labels, we quickly got into this conversation about how you manage health and what did he have access to. And when I told him my experience here in Canada, without labeling it, by the end of the conversation, he said, wow, I would love that system. And he's a diehard Trumpist and probably still voted for Trump. But the point is that, it's like whenever you visit anybody anywhere in the world, literally, and I've studied this extensively, culturally, what do they do when you come to their house? It doesn't matter who you are, what your background. If you're a guest in their house, what do they always do? They invite you in and they feed you their best food, whatever that is. So that is literally a cultural universal. So if we could sit down and dine together without the labels and so on, but you got to get people literally to the table. So, okay, here's my final thing. I'll shut up.
No, that's wonderful. I sense that I don't know how long you guys usually speak, but I would like to share a couple things that I think are important here. Just before we potentially close, but
we're flexible till 7 usually. So it sort of goes to 6:30, but we just wander. As long as the conversation's good, it goes up until 7.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I think the way you put that, Joe, is extremely articulate and very much to the point of the real challenges we're facing. So I think one distinction that's really helpful to make, and this is a distinction that Forrest Landry makes and has developed really, really well, whose work I'd really recommend. And I anticipate, honestly, collaboration, or cross-pollination between this community and Forrest thinking, and there's a lot to say there. But the distinction is between affinity groups and ephemeral groups. I'm not one to make this articulation particularly clear, unfortunately, but we can look at affinity groups as those more or less fixed group identities that we then sort of route our sort of belonging to and through. So obviously the political tribes are a big one. Sport teams, families, but we also know from research that's been done that if you get a group of random people together and split them up into 2 groups, then all of a sudden before too long, they'll come to identify, or at least to my understanding of the research, they'll come to identify, what is effectively arbitrarily with the group A they've been put in or the group B, and then they're going to go at each other. So we know that this is kind of something we do, and we can anthropologically look at the evolution of social living, going back to tribal times, and look at our genes being essentially evolved for fittedness in those constraints of Dunbar, sub-Dunbar, Dunbar number tribes that then sort of interact with each other in ways that aren't that friendly, or maybe they are friendly because they get mediated by shamanic stuff sometimes or whatever. I'm not very well studied in this regard. But we know that people group themselves up and then we'll go at each other, and those identities, when they're challenged, are going to be held on to an awful lot, because we route our stability, psychological stability and belonging and all the rest of it through that. And you guys can be much more articulate about that than me. Ephemeral groups, on the other hand, are shorter lasting. They're not defined in terms of the continued identity one has from belonging to them. So Forrest will give the example of even an ephemeral group as being the essentially random selection of people at an airport who are nevertheless undergoing some process with each other, but are not going to meet up again, right? They didn't come there as team airport. They're all going to depart and go their other ways. But they are nevertheless engaging in an effective process for them getting on the planes and going where they need to go. So there's something productive and functional that's happening there. Now we might say, okay, well, actually this interaction is still mediated on the kind of shared values we have. But as you're alluding to, Joe, like that, we all offer each other food when we come in our houses. So we do have as well this other way of relating to each other that is somehow, at least behaviorally, processually, that can be deeper or is not subject necessarily to capture, as long as we don't all of a sudden start making that group identity primary. Could be more articulate about that. But so on the ephemeral side, what are the kind of structures, ways of building processes for interaction together to link this back up with the whole of the conversation, where we can invite participation in interaction and potentially on solving problems? So the ephemeral group process, if you go to egp.community, you'll see a little bit spoken about this. Zach Stein's involved in the project. Obviously, Forrest is the main architect of the project, to my understanding. They've developed one kind of ephemeral group process that's designed to help communities effectively problem solve better. You might say, well, a community is a kind of a affinity group. And it's like, well, there does have to be a certain shared interest in coming to the table. And that's a core part of the conversation. And we can take it sort of slightly separately. And it's very important. I mean, I call it the sacred art of invitation making, for my own sort of stability. So the idea with the EGP that they've developed is that it's essentially a process of asking and deepening the asking of questions. And so that what is realized through the small group interaction, which occurs in phases, and people do spread to then other groups, and there's a facilitator per group, is that what emerges is, and sourced from everyone, a deepened set of questions relating to the problem that is of interest. So it's a broader, more fuller kind of problem framing exercise, which is critical to the generation of solutions, which engages people in a way that doesn't make their sort of ego, identity, opinions on what should be the case the primary way of interacting, but actually the process of asking questions, which moves us out of that stuckness of identity, but nevertheless achieve something valuable for the community. And there can be lots of different kinds of ephemeral group process. This is one that they're talking about, and there's more to it, and they can speak about it better, and I'm not speaking for them. But I find it very encouraging. And so a big part of what I'm sort of focused in and looking on is, well, what are the kinds of, we effectively want to, and it's not all here yet, we need many more conversations, but what are the ways of effectively inviting people into a kind of ephemeral dynamic where their participation doesn't have them end up coalesce into a fixed and this fixed identity way of being, but that nevertheless has them seen and valued in participating. And I think this core distinction is something to keep in mind regarding the things we have to build, I think, in order to even be, I think, addressing this problem at all. And I'm not trying to come from a grandiose place, because as we've already discussed, this is like a big deal and a big problem. And I mean, the mythological image that seems most salient to me is something Zach's mentioned, Greg and I have spoken about it, it's come up in many conversations I've had, is this notion of the arc. You know, we have these stories, right? We know that these big times of transition come. There have been floods before. And that's, I mean, look, I mean, honestly, it's devastating. It's devastating. So, but what do we do? You know, what choices can we make in the way of love and construction? It looks, you know, it has to be grounded on, for me, and as an honest attempt to understand. You can look at the generator functions, but we have to go deep into the nature of what we are and how we interact, so as do our best not to make the same kinds of fundamental mistakes. And maybe these protocols of gathering itself and the protocols of interaction itself, as part of this broad communication problem, are something that needs to be deeply looked at. So Forrest is very interested not only in wisdom as it can be understood in terms of the development of an individual who has capacity to be in right relationship with the world or something like this. Obviously, that's not the best definition of wisdom in the world, but actually wisdom in terms of the social structures. So what are the kind of wise type of structures? And he has another category as well, which I've forgotten. But what are the kind of wise protocols that essentially enable an ongoing loving transformation, rather than end up having us come into these clustered, disconnected, unable to communicate, and so conflict and violence is the only option type dynamics. And it's right there we need to be thinking, and that requires a lot of reflection. Of course it does. But the idea is that if you can get people who can first hear the call, come together, attempt to understand and embody and enact the values, as messy and as difficult as it's going to be, as much as we're going to fail, but to nevertheless endeavor to extend integrous invitations towards participating in the protocols that we're hopefully and lovingly constructing together, to invite progressively more people in, such that they don't end up necessarily becoming captured by that process, but maintain their and are incentivized, but they're maintained and encouraged and empowered to develop their sovereignty through that process as well, their sovereignty of choice. And so genuinely participate in something which gives and adds value to the community, by itself does not become the thing to then get captured in and just end up as another tribe. I feel like we can try, you know, I feel like we can try.
Amen. Amen. And I think that that was very well said. I look forward. I shot Forrest a note maybe a week ago after I listened to him. Maybe I want to, there's a lot I want to chat with him about. And they're aligning our metaphysics as one, and exploring these kinds of processes as another.
Maybe we can connect. I've found Forrest to be just a lovely human being, and not someone who's like particularly all that interested in email communication in terms of he's not someone who he spends a lot of time, I think, working and on his own processes, you know. But he's
well, if you have contact with him, connect me. I'd love to talk to him. I think for me, so here's some of the we're little particles of dust on a gigantic thing here. We do not have a lot of leverage at this juncture or anything. I mean, for me, this is all about a long game. I mean, and what I mean, and I hope we have the time for it. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to feel our way into a space that is emerging. And this is there's an edge of emergence here. There's a lot of emergences. I'm in a particular edge of a bubble of a particular kind of emergence. And the process of unfolding. And I sort of feel like of it in religious terms at times, but it is an early unfolding that then will have echoes, waves of echoes down across the decades and across the generations. And so for me, what's happening is that there is the metaphor of the ark or the exodus or the exploration. People are beginning the process of exploring various transformations. I think we are in the process of transforming from modernity to whatever comes after that in the 21st century. I think that we need to hold lots of dialectics. And I mean that in conversation. I mean that dialectically community. I mean the potential for heaven and hell, and not being like apocalyptic in a particular way, and recognizing that there's a lot of beauty and goodness all around, and at the same time not being cavalier. How do we hold that? How do we hold self in relationship to other? How do we hold process and content? I think and I think what we're doing is we're feeling our way. And so I think not getting lost in ideas or giving up, but just continuing the process of having, for me, I have a lodestar of value, of be that which enhances dignity, well-being, integrity, be true to what you see. And I've got my own version of offering a thread in this emerging tapestry. And it seems like lots of folks do. And I feel generally hopeful about what the space is. And at the same time, I think that whatever that it becomes, it'd be very different than whatever it is now. And it's just that process of unfolding. And I see you as a seeker and a seer and somebody who's doing beautiful exploration in this space. And I very much heard that today. And so that's my reflection of what I
thank you, Greg.
felt.
Yeah, it's your appearance in this space for me is one that's been it's like added a lot of richness, you know. It was like in someone else who can come forth and hold a certain space of knowledge, as well as a relational sense of what is emerging, and the openness to be available to interaction in that. It's it's rare, and it enables much more, I think. I mean, we all have roles to play, but it enables so much. So I've been really appreciative of your, input. There's definitely been a shaping, that thread has definitely contributed to shaping. But what came through for me actually is just that, yes, even as we're feeling our way in, and of course it's going to all look very different in some important respect, on the cusp of expression, of being here together, of really listening and sensing into just what is doing that unfolding, will feel, I want to say the same. It's, that's maybe not the best language. It'll feel like, for me, when I come back into a space of, for everyone, when I come back into a space of feeling as though I'm heard and valued in communication, but where I'm, even where you can take the witnessing function, when you can step back, and just all of a sudden begin to deepen just an appreciation for the opportunity to be here at all, and the gratitude for that. There has a certain timeless quality to it. And I think it's something in there, more articulately said, which is a continued refreshing source of grounding, even as things change. And it's that I hope, and I think we hope, that if people have a taste of, then all of a sudden we realize ourselves as the continued source of grounding in the groundlessness of it all as it shifts.
Yeah. Very, very nicely said. And
Can I say one thing? Well,
yeah, please.
I worry that so often we're trying to get somewhere else, right? That there's some idealized there, right? And I just want to invite us all to remember that there is no there. Where we really need to get to is here in a meaningful way, and then kind of be in relation with the energy of change that's happening right here. Like I'm sitting in this space of just, this is a beautiful expression of exactly what we need to be doing if we want to be heading toward whatever's better in the future. And I think we're all showing up really well for that. So that's
may I add one comment as well?
Yeah.
Along those lines. So yeah, I said my little thing out to everybody, but honestly, in my view, my own sons know who I am. We have lots of conversations, no problem. But the way that all of you here speak and the way you reflect and what you model, it's not about whether you agree with every philosophical position. It's about the way you process and share the information and the love, if I could even use that term, and the positive energy. And that's what we're privileged to enjoy. The one thing I do tell my students along these lines, because I don't get too sappy. I try to stay to the topics and the subjects that I have to teach. But I do say, listen, we really are lucky and privileged to be able to sit here and think and read and reflect.
100%.
That's our real privilege. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if we could figure out ways through social media, through the ways that we speak with each other, etc., practical ways to reach those so many other communities that maybe you're insulated from this sort of thing. Again, not because you're elitist or you've got all the answers, nothing like that, but it's about literally engaging people in meaningful ways and in their own lives, in their own worlds. If we could do that or figure out ways to do that, that to me is where we could really transform things. And the other thing I'll say is just, and again, this is my bias, I really have far more hope for the under 30 crowd than I do people my age. Not knocking people my age. I love them. I grew up with them. We're all 60 or whatever now, but we have a lot harder time changing our views and our ways of being at my age, I find, which is so. But I find that younger people are they're open to just about anything. So
right. So I think if we can, I think loving what we have and then figuring out a way to share it,
Yeah. Yeah. There was just one thing that, so I love football, soccer to you guys.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the best team in the world, Tottenham Hotspur. And, it's an interesting thing. It's like, yeah, I think we've all experienced people in our lives who maybe where they're at is not willing to change in a way that can appropriately maybe truly see us. And this is painful. And then I think, and this is, I don't have the dots connected. This is just an image. Hey, it's just a little image. It's not even a particularly cool one, but I think of new young kids coming through in football teams, and they do excite. They excite everyone. They're a good player if they're embodying the values of that team, maybe the hard work, dedication, a bit of flair and talent, then yes, you do get your old grumpy fans who are like, oh, it's not as good as it was in my day. But actually when they get to a game, they watch it, they get involved, and they start appreciating. And I think there's something deep in us there that providing the environment enables us to participate in a way that doesn't immediately challenge us to the point where we can no longer pay attention. I think of what it is to be in a crowd, and I think of spirituality and religion, and I think of the importance of breathing together. That is it. Respirar is the etymology of spirituality, of spiritual. That breathing together.
Back to breath.
Yes, back to breath. And I think of a crowd in a football game, and what is the fan doing? They're genuinely contributing, and COVID makes that so clear now, because the games aren't as good without the crowds in there. They're just using their voices, and it contributes to something. So environments where just the breathing and the key and the attention paid itself creates a dynamic enabling of something to emerge. Like in that framing, there is space and room for invitation to much more than what looks like just an elitist group to me. And I'm not from any elitist class whatsoever, even though I sound like maybe I could be confused with that. And breathing together, sharing the love. I think you put it beautifully, Greg.
Amen. Well, on that note, that's a beautiful place. Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing the wisdom to offer, and I appreciate what collectively emerged here in our time together. And I look forward to both being and becoming.
I'll be back.
All righty. Guys, take care.
Thanks, guys. Thank you,
Yep,
Tim.
thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yep.
Bye-bye.